Kornel, I received your book, A Fractured Liberation, Korea Under US Occupation. I had a fabulous time reading through it. It's incredibly well written for history, which is not always the easiest thing to do, and it creates a wonderful sense of emotion, of feeling, of lived realities, of literature, analysis. And perhaps what makes this kind of unique, Kornel, is that it starts with a personal story. You recount a family's journey from Pyongyang to American occupied zones. Could you start with that aspect of it for us, please?
Yeah, sure. First of all, let me just start off by saying the way you opened, I'm very heartened to hear. I worked very hard to try to make the writing both accessible and engaging. As someone who was trained in a doctoral program in history, you are sort of conditioned to write a particular kind of way in the academy. And some of that I tried to unlearn for the second book project. And it took a lot of learning, which was quite fun to try to figure out, how to write more accessibly, how to write more engagingly, thinking about things like writing more punchier topic sentence and the rest of it. But so
Mm.
thank you for that opening. It's really heartening to hear. Um, yeah, so this book is inspired by a family history, which I can, from my own memory, can date back to when I was probably 7 or 8 years old.
Mm.
And I was born, my parents were Korean immigrants. They had settled in New York City, and we lived in a small little apartment. And, I would hear them speak late at night. And I knew that they were speaking late at night intentionally when we
Mm.
went down, right? They did not want us to hear their stories, right? And part of this makes sense. This is part of kind of, I think, the immigrant story. It's not specific to my family, which is your family came from somewhere else.
Mm.
There was no need to burden you with tawdry, difficult, challenging history, right? That's not what they wanted. They didn't want their children to look backward. They wanted their children to look forward, right?
Mm.
Um, but I would be awoken at night by these conversations between my parents and my grandmother. And my Korean at the time, and still now, wasn't fantastic, but enough to, hear enough to grasp enough of the kind of core meanings of what they were talking about. They would talk about the war, and they would talk about the occupation and escaping from, from the north sometime, right?
Mm.
And and then the next morning I would wake up and I would ask my dad, so I heard you speak. Like, what were you speaking about? And he would tell me, nothing important, nothing
Mm.
that worries you, right? And then as time went on and as I got older and as my family got older, as my parents got older, something changes as you get older, right? Like maybe you think about your mortality and you start sharing these stories that you wanted to keep, hidden for the longest time. And perhaps they grew some level of comfort sharing with me at that time, seeing me as an adult. And slowly, fragments of the story of my family's journey and their story with the occupation and the war started to emerge. I mean, really, piece by piece. But the moment that I remember the most, there's two moments I remember the most.
Mm.
The first is at my Kunapa's house, my uncle's house, where we'd get into these arguments. This was the summer of 1994, and if you remember the summer of 1994, that's where the standoff over North Korea's nuclear program occurred, right? And there was, back then it was all watching it over, the evening news and these anchors talking about how, because of the crisis that the Korean Peninsula might tip over into the Second Korean War, and this is a moment where Clinton and then Jimmy Carter was eventually sent to negotiate a deal. And so in my household, when we all gathered at my Kanapa's house, we talked about, they argued about American policy. And my Kunapa was sort of a, anti-communist hardliner that thought that the US should not negotiate at all. I had other family members, including my father, who was anti-communist but thought, hey, like we need to negotiate and come to some sort of compromise and so forth.
Mm.
But at the end of the way that conversation always ended was with Mike Kanapa saying, well, if it wasn't for the Americans, we'd all be living under the communists now, right? And that statement that suggested that there was only two choices, that it was all binary. It was either communism or, liberal capitalism, military bases or, right, totalitarianism. And it just sort of stuck with me, right?
Mm.
And so that was the first moment. The second moment I remember is my grandmother was passing. She was very sick. She had cancer of some form, and I was visiting her at the hospital. And I know she didn't have much time. She was very weak. At the time, I had just started a PhD program in history at the University of Chicago, and I went to visit her in New York when I was on vacation from Chicago. And when my parents told her that I was a historian or training to be a historian, her eyes lit up. She was very weak, but her eyes lights up, and she says, "That is great." She's like, "We have a family of distinguished historians, right?" And she's like, your great granduncle was," and she gave me some name, and I'll tell you who the name is later. And at the time, I wasn't studying Korean history. I was training to be a Mexican historian at the time. Uh, so I entered the PhD program at the University of Chicago to study Mexican history. And then as an undergrad, I actually concentrated in modern European history. So I was always interested in history, but I was sort of nomadic in my interests. And I only came to this particular project much later.
Mm.
So she tells me this history, and since I'm not studying Korean history, the name doesn't ring a bell or anything, right? And then
Mm.
she passes away, and a couple of years later, I become interested in sort of writing about this history. And I asked my father, I was like, right before grandmother passed away, she said that, there was a famous historian among my family members. And he says, yes, there was. His name is Munil Pyong. So your great granduncle was Munil Pyong, who was a distinguished historian, writer. I think he was maybe one of the first editors of the Joseon Ilbo, right? Which came to a personal shock to me, right? Because I grew up on the streets of New York, and I had the typical immigrant experience. I was playing stickball on the street. I was
Mm.
playing roller hockey. We were all immigrant kids. I grew up in a neighborhood of Irish, Mexican, Korean, and Chinese kids, and there were no parents around. Most of our parents were doing working class, had working class jobs. And the idea that there was a kind of writer or an intellectual or, anything of that sort, it was sort of unfathomable to me, right? Like it was more fathomable that I could be like a professional baseball player than
Mm.
it was that I could be an academic or intellectual, right? And so it really did come of as a shock. But it was these kind of personal stories that eventually got me to kind of thinking about writing this book. And obviously this is a I hope is a rigorous historical scholarship, right? Is what I wrote. But at the base of it, what inspired it was my family story, my family
Mm.
history, and these fragments I sort of, got along the way. And I wanted to fill in all of these gaps that I had as, I was growing up and hearing these stories because they were just fragments. And the book was about kind of putting all of the pieces together, right, as part of a puzzle, and then bringing out all of the context that obviously my parents didn't know or have. And so which is again to say the personal history inspired it,
Mm.
but it was but at the end of it, I was hoping to produce something that was rigorous, well researched, well written, and so forth, right? And to say something that would intervene in the scholarship to some degree as well.
I love the idea that your grandmother's eyes would light up. It's nice to be able to influence people in that way to make them shine. You said that your kunapa, your uncle, said that if it wasn't for the Americans, you'd all be communist. Now, Han Duck-soo, he said something recently, when they were talking about tariffs with South Korea and the United States. He said, we owe the Americans, essentially. And that sort of divided the country again. When you said that you wanted to build a picture, at the end of your book, Kornel, you suggest in the chapter called "The Paths Not Taken," you said that the division was not inevitable, that there was all of these other options that the country, didn't go down. Can you tell us about this picture, this final sort of conclusion or picture? I'm jumping right to the end of your book now, but
Sure.
this uninevitable division, because now it seems so cemented, but you're talking about paths not taken.
Yeah, so let me talk about this in two parts. One is
Mm,
sort of talk about it in relation to sort of the existing scholarship, which was um, for the most part, was interested in the occupation period between 1945 and 1948, right? The
mm,
the the years right after Japan's surrender and the end of the World War II, until the moment where you have two separate governments on the peninsula in the fall of 1948. And most scholarship, which makes a lot of sense, right? Given the division is still here, the Cold War still rages on the Korean Peninsula as an anachronism that just refuses to die after 75 years. So it
mm,
makes a lot of sense that people are curious about the origins of the Korean War and these divisions, right? But I think in a kind of rush to get to that particular story, scholarship has drawn a relatively straight line from August 1945 with the partition um, to 1948, and then of course the Korean War in 1950. And in doing so, they've also reproduced what I call Cold War binaries, suggesting again
mm,
that it was communism or capitalism, right? It was reactionary versus revolutionary, and etc. And what my book tries to do is I try to recover the voices, particularly of two groups that have been neglected. One is ordinary Koreans and their aspirations. And when you look at their aspirations, I think the spectrum is much wider than the Cold War one we have sort of imposed on Koreans, right? So that's the first group. The second group is the military reformers within the military government, right? And so the person that has been highlighted and of course shows up in my own book and narrative is Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, who was the leader of the occupation. And of course, makes sense. He had the most power, had the most influence, etc. But I think by kind of neglecting the reformers within the military government, we get a sense of a kind of monolithic American response, right? That it was all anti-communist um, and all hardliners. Where when you look at these group of reformers, people like Stuart Meacham, the labor reformer, or you look at Arthur Boone, the land reformer, right? These advisors within the military government, again, much like the ordinary Koreans, their responses to Korean aspirations and their initiatives for reform, again, show a much wider spectrum,
mm,
show that there were American reformers, particularly those from the State Department, that wanted to institute land reform, labor rights, wanted to purge collaborators from the bureaucracy and the police, right? So they had a vision for democratization and reform that was different and from the one envisioned by the military high command led by Lieutenant General John R. Hodge. So I think in recovering those aspirations and recovering those neglected responses by other American officials, what I tried to show is that the line was not as straight as people thought from
mm,
August 1945 to 48 and 50, but in fact, that line was much more jagged, right? And the other thing I try to do is I introduce the example of the Jeju example, right, which I talk about prominently in the book. And the Jeju example is a moment where uh, is a place and a time where you could see like what could have been
mm,
if there was no military occupation, or if the military occupation didn't have such a heavy hand on things, right? And just to give listeners a little bit of a background to the Jeju example is, Jeju is the island province off the southern coast of the Korean Peninsula. And it was the place where military government teams showed up the latest, right? So uh, John Hodge with its military units showed up in early September to Incheon, right? Was the port in which they entered. They began to set up military governments in Seoul, and then once they set up military governments, then in Seoul they proceeded southward and tried to kind of replicate military governments in every province, right?
mm,
It was sort of like federalism for military government, if you will, right? Having smaller governments. So being Jeju being the furthest away from Seoul, American military government teams didn't arrive in Jeju until mid-November, mid-late November. And in fact, the people of Jeju were shocked and surprised to see American military government teams. They thought if they were going to see any foreign occupying officials or military, it would have been the Soviets, right?
Mm, mm,
And part of this is like news didn't quite, people would wonder, well, how come they didn't get the news, right? Well, news didn't travel that quickly from the mainland to Jeju at this particular time, right? And so the point is that they had several months before the Americans would arrive. And as a result, they had these 2 months to sort of determine their own future and path for independence for the people of Jeju. And, people of Jeju have, and it's still known to be fiercely independent. And so the People's Committee in Jeju established their own People's Committee and acted effectively as the de facto government of the island, right? And it was led by people who had anti-colonial credentials. The two particular leaders had helped organize the Hanyos, right? The famous Korean women divers
mm,
during the colonial periods. And in trying to sort of labor organize among them, they spent several years in prison. So after liberation, these leaders had real prestige with the public. They established a government, and what is surprising is, despite their leftist tendencies, they chart a rather moderate course for independence for the people of Jeju, right? They take Japanese properties into custody.
mm,
They do try and purge collaborators, but only the most notorious, right? And of course, that's a hazy definition, but nevertheless, right? They're not trying to cast a wide net. Um, and then they're doing practical things. They're building and opening schools. They're trying to maintain public safety, and so forth, right? And so when the Americans arrived, the 59th Military Army, in mid-November 1945, they're quite happy with the state of things, right? The state of affairs in Jeju, and therefore essentially allow them to go and allow them to run it as they see fit, right? Given what they see. And the interesting thing about Jeju, that is they are largely self-governing until 1947. So if you think about the events in between those times, right, there is the autumn uprisings in 1946, right,
mm,
which begins in Daegu and then spreads all over the southern zone of Korea, right? About a third of all of southern Korea is touched by the peasant uprisings in autumn 1946, but not Jeju, right? So Jeju avoids the rebellions, they avoid a lot of the unrest, right?
mm,
All the way till 1947, and things only change because the military government in Seoul then sends a hardline anti-communist from the mainland, who then brings the rightist Northwest youth with him, right, to Jeju and replaces the government with these hardliners. And the Jeju people are not just upset because these people are hardliners and rightists, but they're upset because they're outsiders, right?
mm,
And they're not happy with that. And so, ironically, is the most peaceful place for most of the occupation. But by the spring of 1948, it is the site of the most violent conflict. But the whole point is like Jeju shows you, a place where what could have Korea looked like if Koreans were sort of left to their own devices, right? And if you look at the Jeju example, and I get it, maybe Jeju is not completely exemplar, but the Jeju example is interesting because they're on average more leftist. Their People's Committee is more leftist than most People's Committee elsewhere on the Korean Peninsula, right? And
mm,
yet they find a peaceful transition into independence and chart a rather moderate course for independence, right? So that's sort of one example. And then the other places in the books where I think about alternative examples are moments where officials, particularly Hodge,
mm,
who um, has a choice to make. And these are moments, whether it's um, instituting land reform, whether it's backing the centrist coalition of moderate rightists and leftists, right? All of these moments, Hodge has a choice to make and other officials have choices to make. And each time it's close. So one of the things I try to show is that Hodge is not a mindless, knee-jerk anti-communist. He is
Mm,
anti-communist, but not knee-jerk, right? And so one of the things I try to do with this book is to contextualize Hodge. Think
mm,
about like, why is he doing the things he's doing, but also showing some complexity and nuance in his thinking. And in doing so, really showing that there were like he understood by the spring of 1946 that backing Syngman Rhee is a bad idea, and he sees and identifies fascist tendencies within Rhee and is now desperately looking for alternatives, right? And this is where he lands on the centrist coalition led by Yo and Young, the center-left nationalist, right? And Kim Kyu-sik, the center-right nationalist, right? And he publicly supports their political efforts in at the end of June 1946. And the liberal and socialist advisors within the military government think we got a chance now. There's a chance here, right? They were really sort of down and dismayed and pessimistic about unification and things like that, given the early choices that Hodge and the military command made by backing, more conservative and some reactionary forces, right? Not just Rhee and Kim Gu, but also the Korean Democratic Party, right? Members who, you know, many of them who had benefited under Japanese colonial rule, and some would allege, collaborated with the Japanese. So there was a lot of pessimism. But when Hodge publicly supports them, people like Arthur Boone and Stuart Meacham, there's a kind of revived optimism that unity is possible and that reforms are possible that would help lead toward the change, with of greater odds of reunification. And but at each of these moments,
mm,
you know, Hodge, the decision is close, but he always tilts. He just can't get himself to make the decision to support the center rightists and the center leftists and purge, in particular, the police of colonial elements, right? Even though he knows, like, the centrist coalition will only be given a real chance because all the reformers tell him, right, if we purge the police, right, and we get rid of the police state. And one of the things I highlight, one of the big documents I highlight in the book is this document that was dated in April 21st, 1947. And it's a draft statement where, it talks about Hodge using his powers to remove the two police chiefs, right? And demanding that the police rapidly purge their department of the former colonial police and hire people with, conceptions of liberalism and so forth, right? But but it never gets signed, right? And a few months later, Yoon Young, the center left, popular center left nationalist, is shot dead in broad daylight, right? They're locked in a stalemate with the Russians, the Soviets, over how to unify the country. And Syngman Rhee is daily maligning Hodge as a communist in the press, right? In the Korean press. And at that point, it looks very bad. And at that point, in fact, Hodge thinks it's so bad, he recommends to the War Department that we should cut bait,
mm,
and just simply withdraw from Korea, understanding that withdrawal would almost certainly lead to, a takeover by northern, mostly communist forces at that point, right? That the peninsula would go red at that point. And they're okay with it. The War Department, anyway, is okay with it because they do not think Korea is strategic militarily
mm,
to hold, to make a kind of last stand, right? Just to think a little bit about the global context at this point, right? The Americans had already issued the Marshall Plan, which meant hundreds of millions of dollars in supporting Greece and Turk fighting communism there. You had the fight in China between the nationalists and the communists there.
mm,
And the War Department understood that the military appropriations weren't unlimited, so they had to make choices, and they were fine without making a. They thought Korea was not strategic enough. And it's ironically enough the State Department that says, no, we have to stay and we have to hold on to half the peninsula, even though it was the State Department that had been criticizing Hodge and the military high command this whole time for, taking this sort of hardline anti-communist and not instituting the reforms that they had suggested, right? But at this moment,
Mm.
they say no, and it's because they have a kind of larger vision for how they're going to create kind of a new regional order in Northeast Asia, right? And that meant reconstructing Japan, right, the former enemy, and Korea was seen as very important to the reconstruction of Japan at that point, and as part of, you could argue, America's larger global liberal vision, right, for world order at that particular point. Um, and the State Department wins that particular argument, and I would argue probably wins the argument for the next 4 decades, essentially, right, about sort of anti-communism and needing to contain and fight it in many parts of the world. And so the book really is about these moments where there was a real decision to be made and people really torn, right? And I should say it wasn't just Hodge who was torn at each of these decisions. In 1947, when the War Department recommends that they just cut bait in Korea,
Mm.
and the State Department says, no, we need to stay, a lot of the reformers are really, they agonize over this decision. I have diaries of these reformers who say, who have regrets. They say things like, if only we weren't so scared of communism, we could have nurtured, real kind of democratic institutions and so forth here, which I find fascinating. And they're not unequivocal about their support for this plan of having just a separate, having separate countries on the Korean Peninsula. They have real doubts, but at the end of the day, this 50-50 jump ball, they
Mm.
decide ultimately it was better that they stayed, held elections, drafted a constitution, instituted some reforms, um, and held on to half the peninsula, right?
Mm.
And I'm also ambiguous, ambivalent. I think they're in an enormously tough spot in the summer, at the end of the summer of 1947, right? You understand that if you stay, it's very likely that the peninsula is indefinitely divided. They all know this. If they run the separate elections, create a separate government, they have no idea when there will be reunification, right? They understand its unity, but they also understand that if they don't stay, right, in their opinion, right, that there'd be a communist takeover of the entire peninsula.
Mm. I think one of the things that many Koreans and international observers struggle with is the fact that at the end of the Second World War, with the defeat of the Japanese army, that it was Korea that was divided and not Japan, and Japan remains in place, the emperor remains, and yet Korea, that was essentially a victim of all of this, rather than having their freedom in 1945 and the liberation and the chance to choose, everything you've described is America and the decisions of Hodge and how this has gone. Do you have any observation of that particular aspect? So I'm going one step back here, Kornel, and saying, why was it America in the first place that's making these decisions, whereas in Japan the situation was very different?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, David. I so I'll go even a step back further to
Mm.
the Second World War, right? And the question was around, so there's a famous Cairo Declaration, right, which is signed on by the great Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, nationalist China, and Great Britain, which promises Korea its independence, but has this addendum in due course, right? The famous addendum. And what I found out about that addendum, which is interesting, is initially the first draft of the Cairo Declaration, which FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, the U.S. president at the time, he drafted that, or had his writers draft it. It says Korea would get its independence basically right away or immediately, right? It was very clear about the timeline. But FDR had concerns. He had doubts about the readiness of colonized people to take on the role of governing themselves right away, right? And quite often he referred to the example of the Philippine example, the U.S. colony, which was given its independence only after 4 decades of colonial rule. But he thought that was a sort of exemplar of colonial tutelage that could lead to independence in a way that would, not be violent and where colonized people would be ready to govern themselves. Um, but so, but his thought was this, but we're not going to colonize these places, not individually, right? What we will do is, so he envisioned, he came up with this notion of trusteeship. So this idea was that you would have a multinational trusteeship. The great powers would jointly help govern these areas until colonized people were ready to become independent. And this is what FDR suggests to Stalin at Potsdam and these other meetings. And Stalin is on board with it, but Stalin says, but they're not waiting 40 years. We need to figure out a much shorter timeline, right? Stalin being much more sensitive to colonized aspirations, whatever you might think of Stalin, right? I mean, I think he understood that the colonized people were not going to wait 40 years after being colonized for 40 years in the case of Korea. Um, but multilateral trusteeship uh, gets scrambled because FDR dies, right before the end of the Second World War. And then when you have the dropping of the atomic bombs, there's a mad scramble in far Northeast Asia. And one of the things that happens, which you very well know, is uh, the Red Army is the first to get to the Korean Peninsula, right? And there's sort of this unwritten rule, right? At least in Europe, and to some degree, is the first there could largely exert political control, right? And this is where on August 9th, August 10th, American officials are very concerned that the Soviet Red Army would seize full control of the entire Korean Peninsula, and this is where they send Dean Rusk and Tick Bonesteel, the two lower level, middling military officials, into a room to find a dividing line to propose to the Soviets. And this is where these two military officials scan through a National Geographic map because they have no idea, right, what Korea looks like, and decides on the 38th parallel. And Dean Rusk admits, like, it was completely arbitrary. We just simply wanted Seoul, the Korean capital, on the American side. That was literally the rationale for it. They offer it up to Soviets. They are very doubtful that the Soviets would agree to this, right? Because the Soviets have the military edge here. They already have troops there. Why would they agree to it? They could seize the whole thing. And not only could they seize the whole thing, why would they take less land as part of this arrangement, right? Now, part of it was this supposed to be a temporary arrangement, right? It was understood that it was supposed to be temporary. And to their shock, Stalin almost very quickly acquiesces to this division, right? Now, what's interesting is fast forward a week, right? So this August 10th, right? Fast forward a week, August 17th, Stalin asks Truman on August 17th, I would like your permission to land troops in Hokkaido, right? The northernmost islands of Japan, right? As part of perhaps what would be a joint occupation of Japan, right? Which sort of mirrored the notion of trusteeship for colonized people, but this would be for a defeated country.
Mm.
Truman says no. We will be the sole occupying power in Japan, right? So it gives you a sense that the Soviets are more accommodating in these early moments of the post-war period. And this is not because Stalin is some peace-loving person, right? But Stalin was a realist, as scholars, quite often say, and he understood the power dynamics between the U.S. and the Soviets. The U.S. was much richer. They were militarily more powerful, particularly with the atomic weapons that they had just dropped on the two cities of Japan. And he also thought that he needed the Americans to create a new post-war order that included guaranteeing the security of the Soviets, right? Which had lost 20 million lives in the Second World War, right? Which is something Americans don't ever know about, right? Um, and so they're accommodating in this particular moment, but so you have the division in Korea, you have Japan remaining, the defeated country remaining. Again, as you suggest, really deeply ironic, if you will, right? The defeated country is stayed whole, is maintained as whole, and the Korean Peninsula is split. Now, the other important thing that happened was Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, is head of all of the Asia of all of the American military forces in Asia, right? He's the supreme commander, which not only includes Japan, it also includes the Philippines, it also includes Korea, right? At that particular moment after the war in 1945, MacArthur is essentially ruling over 80 million people, right? He might have more power than any single person at that particular moment, right? Um, but his only interest and focus really is to transform Japan into a democratic, peace-loving society.
Mm.
And if you know anything about MacArthur, he has sort of messianic visions, or you might call delusions, right? Like he is the only one that
Mm.
can transform these people, right? And if you read John Dower's great book, published in 1999, Embracing Defeat, he talks about this, right? This sort of messianic vision. But what was interesting about that messianic vision was even though MacArthur was an anti-New Deal Republican and was against reform in the United States, for Japan, he was willing to support the liberal socialist advisors, right? And allows them to purge the police, the home ministries, institutes land reform in the spring of 1946, right? Installs labor rights that even the communists there are quite pleased with, right? That recognizes unions and collective bargaining, and et cetera, right? And this is because MacArthur's messianic delusion that he's the only one that can transform Japan into a peace-loving society and people. He does not have these concerns for Japan's formerly colonized people. He has they're all afterthoughts at this point. And as
Mm.
a result, when Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, right, who is his subordinate, right, contacts his MacArthur and tells him about the conditions in South Korea, MacArthur tells him, you rule or govern as you see needed and as fit. Meaning he relinquishes authority over the Southern Zone to Hodge, and essentially, at least for the first 6 months, gives Hodge essentially the power of fiat, where he can make policy by fiat, essentially, is what he does, right?
Mm.
And Hodge is the polar opposite of General Douglas MacArthur. He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have messianic delusions, right? General John Hodge grew up as a farm boy in Golconda, Illinois, right, which is a farming area in Illinois. He went to Army officer training school in Illinois, and he had to work his way up the ranks. So unlike the other famous World War II leaders, right, General Patton, Joseph Stilwell, Douglas MacArthur, these people all went to the famous military school West Point in the United States. Hodge, he had to work his way up the ladder and then eventually became a very distinguished general during the Second World War, winning, bronze medals, Purple Hearts, etc. And
Mm.
one of the reasons he won these awards, he was seen as soldiers. He would be out in the front lines with his men. And so he was diligent, he was loyal, and he was above all dutiful.
Mm.
But the flip side of that coin was he saw the world in black and white. He was quite rigid, right? And this is where he was very different from his superior, Douglas MacArthur. So when he arrives in Korea and sees this, what he identifies as disorder, way too much rapid change, right, with the People's Committees and the Korean People's Republic, he he wants to undo all of this, right? He wants to go back to the status quo, right? Which I do think to a large degree is inspired by his personality traits, right? To a large degree, and the personality traits that are nurtured by the military government for the most part, which I do think there's a certain degree of anti-communism, right? Particularly during this time,
Mm.
that is nurtured among these people. But at the same time, that didn't stop Douglas MacArthur from supporting these kinds of reform, at least for the first year of the occupation in Japan. And so that is, that is the major difference. And then and therefore you have this great ironic reversal, if you will, where the hated enemy, right, just from weeks ago, gets democratization and reform. And the colonized subject, who was said to be subjugated by right and they were supposed to be emancipated or liberated really gets the hard line and discipline, right? And this is really the reasons for it, right? The developments right immediately after the war, who is assigned as the leaders of these particular occupation zones, etc. But with all of that said, what I tried to suggest in the book is that that doesn't determine, like, Korea's fate is still not determined. It's made more difficult, right? In terms of unity and democratizing the Korean Peninsula, made more difficult. But I suggest even with those important decisions that are made early on, as time passes, there are other moments, right? Those aren't the last moments to speak of where a crucial decision had to be made, right? And one of the things I suggest is that the same reformers that are in the military government in Japan who are doing, who are offering and instituting all kinds of initiatives for democratization, those people are also in Korea. In fact, some of them are the very same people. Wolf Lajinsky, the land reformer, who helps develop and design land reform in Japan, he's sent to Korea, right? So these advisors are still there. The difference is their military commander is different. One has messianic delusions of transforming people, and the other one thinks that my job here is just to hold the fort,
Mm.
hold the line, right? Until until bigger decisions are made from Washington, D.C.
Staying on that individual level of analysis and the importance of whether somebody went to West Point or was a farm boy from Illinois, if we turn to some Korean figures, and I love that your book does do that, Cornell, is there an idea that Korea didn't have a single unifying figure, perhaps somebody like a Gandhi, an Ataturk, a Ho Chi Minh, or a Lenin? It had other figures. It had Kim Gu, it had Yo Eun Hyung, it had Cho Man Shik, and these people, but there wasn't a single figure that was powerful enough to unite them. I'm not sure. I would love to hear about some of these, particularly, Yo Eun Hyung, who you've touched on briefly, or any that you find are interesting, because that always seemed the missing part of the story to me. Lee Seung-man was chosen by the United States, Kim Il-sung was chosen by the Soviets, but there were others that perhaps the Koreans might or could or would have chosen instead.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's a great question again. Um, I think one of the things I would say is that Syngman Rhee is not quite chosen. He is at some moment, right?
Mm, mm,
But toward the end of it, if you read the book, I would really suggest like they really did not want, right? Rhee was not their
mm,
first choice, their second choice, maybe they're not third choice. But Rhee, to his credit, in terms of his political acumen, I suggest outmaneuvered the American officials, right? Even till the very end, Hodge is looking for some other replacement and tries this sort of Hail Mary, if you will, right? This desperate attempt by bringing back Soje Pil, right? Philip Chazon, it was his English name, who at the time was probably 80 years old. He was an independence activist, but he had married, an American woman, had a long-standing medical practice in the Philadelphia area, and hadn't been back to Korea in 40 years, right? And he made Syngman Rhee look spry and young in comparison, right? Like he died 2 or 3 years later from cancer. He almost
mm,
didn't make the trip because his doctors were like, you're not fit enough to do that long flight, right? So my only point here is that there is this notion, right? Rhee is selected. He is and there's no doubt Rhee can't come into power without American support. On the other
mm.
hand, that support is very conditional and um, in many ways, it's really forcing the action through his brinkmanship that brings him to power, right? Now, with all of that said, it's true. You know, um, you have many different leaders because the Korean leadership during the colonial period is spread out all over the world, as you know, primarily because of Japanese repression, right? And so you have overseas leaders in places like Shanghai, right? The Korean Provisional Government, which was considered the Korean government in exile, led by Kim Gu, and his sort of right-hand man was Kim Kyu-sik, who was the foreign minister there. And then you had Rhee in the United States, organizing in places like Hawaii and the eastern coast of the United States, where he had developed close networks with people in power within the State Department. Um, and then you had, folks who stayed on, right? Johan Young being one of them, who spent many, many years in a colonial prison. And then along with him, you had the leader of the Communist Party in the South, right? And so, uh, as you suggested, there was a lot of different uh, leaders, but I do think Johan Young, at least in the South,
Mm.
was probably the person, and at least that was the opinion of the reformers. So there are two groups who thought Yo was the only one that they saw him as the savior of Korea. One was the reformers within the military government, right? Almost all of them thought that Yo was the only one, and part of it was because they thought uh, they appreciated Kim Kyu-sik, but he just didn't have the kind of charisma and the kind of popular following, right? And because Kim was not comfortable as a politician. Kim Kyu-sik was he was a bookworm. He was orphaned at 6 by a famous American missionary, Horace Underwood, right, who started a school that would eventually become Yonsei. He was sent to Roanoke College in Virginia in the United States, where he majored in English and in history. And when he was not being the foreign minister in the Korean provisional government and moonlighting, he was moonlighting as a English literature professor at right Chinese universities. And when he comes back, when the KPG is returns to Southern Korea, he completely avoids the limelight. Whereas Kim Gu has a huge celebration in Dongdaemun Stadium with 30,000 people showing up and so forth, right? But the reformers thought that Yo was the one, right? And interestingly enough, the other group that thought Yo was the only one that could sort of unite these people was former Japanese colonial officials. And how do we know this? Well, there were whispers, there were always whispers that Yo had collaborated to some degree with the Japanese. Like, how could he have not, right? He had stayed in Korea and so forth, right? And so, almost everybody was tarnished with or tagged with the charge of collaboration. So right before the Americans support are willing to publicly support the centrist coalition, they want to know Yo is clean, right?
Mm.
The Americans do not want to have pie on their face, right? And so they send uh, uh, several military investigators to Japan to interview all of the former colonial officials, right? To make sure he didn't collaborate, right? And at this point, the Japanese colonial officials have zero reason to lie or, right? I mean, they are detained, imprisoned in Japan and still waiting their outcome, etc. But there's no reason to lie about any of these things, right? They owe Yo nothing, in fact.
Mm.
Um, and this man comes back, the chief investigator comes back and says, they were like, we tried. We tried to get him on our side. We tried to get him to collaborate. He just refused. He refused. And their assessment is he's the only person, the only leader that can unify the Korean people. And even this military investigator, who's an American military official, says it is perhaps the greatest homage I have ever read of a single person, right? Like former oppressors
Mm.
saying this thing
Mm.
about this person. And the other thing was that politically, Yo had a vision for a united popular front, right? He thought that it didn't matter if you're a capitalist, right? It didn't matter. Like all that mattered is that you did not work explicitly and supported the Japanese colonial system.
Mm.
That is all that mattered to him. And so for him, his vision and the reason he clashed with Pak, who is the communist leader, right, over the Korean People's Republic, was precisely because of their sharp divisions over who they thought should rule, right? What kind of coalition should rule Korea? And for Yo, he thought it should be a united popular front that included workers, capitalists, right, farmers, etc. And for Pak thought the Korea should be run by a revolutionary vanguard, right? led by those who were enlightened, understood Marxist doctrine and the whole nine yards, right? And it was that split
Mm.
that it was that division that eventually forced Yo out of the Korean People's Republic, which he started, right? Essentially, Pak runs a palace coup, is what happens. He stacks the committee with mostly, hardline communist activists, and eventually Yo is marginalized, and then Yo forms his own People's Party about 6 weeks later, is what he does, right? And so I think Yo was the person, and then in the North, it was, as you said, Cho Man-sik, right? The center-right nationalist, the Christian nationalist,
Mm.
who was probably like the center-right version of Yo, but I would say probably didn't have as pristine of a record resisting the Japanese. He did, but not quite, right? He was called the Gandhi of Korea, and he had a great deal of popular support in part as a Christian nationalist because in Pyongyang at the time was right the most Christian city in all of Asia. It was known as
Mm.
the Jerusalem of the East. And so he had quite a bit of popular support. And when Soviets arrived, they're very suspect about the Communist Party there. They're disorganized, they think they're weak, etc. And they throw their support initially behind Cho Man-sik and envision a kind of popular front, right? Is what they envision with Cho Man-sik kind of leading it, right? And of course, that all falls apart 6 months later because Cho refuses to back trusteeship in Korea and then is put under house arrest essentially for the rest of the occupation period. But that was the moment, right, where you could imagine a pairing of Yo and Cho, right? A center right nationalist with popular support and Yo and Young with popular support. Now, I'm not naive. Undoubtedly, there would have been bloodshed. There would have been some violence, etc. There was no way Korea was going to emerge out of 40 years of colonial rule unscathed and make a perfect transition into independence, right?
Mm.
I'm not that is not, my suggestion, right? But my suggestion is if we're thinking about a unified Korea, right? And a Korea that could have been, more democratic earlier on, not completely democratic, right?
Mm.
But like have things like land redistribution and workers' rights, right? Like those weren't pie in the sky dreams. They did it in Japan, right? Like if you did it in Japan with a former enemy, why couldn't you do that for colonized people, right? Subject, right? So these weren't pie in the sky kind of aspirations. Um, and again, I'm not suggesting it would have been a perfect transition,
Mm.
all peaceful, etc., right? But could there have been a unified Korea that could have taken on more kind of democratic forms earlier on? I think the answer is yes to that.
I agree that it might have been messy in various ways. Absolutely. You talked about Yeon Hyung's impeccable collaboration record, and then Cho Man-sik's good, but perhaps not as clean. And that's something that still gets talked about today in modern discourse collaboration. When the Democratic Party filed to impeach Yoon Suk-yeol, one of the claims in there, aside from martial law, was that he was being too nice to the Japanese. And that was something that they positioned. Now, in your book, you reference Park Mun-che's observation that the most hated group of people at the time was not the Japanese, but those pro-Japanese collaborators. It makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. Could you perhaps unpack this a little bit for us, Kornel? Because I still feel the wake and the riptides and the after effects of this today.
Yeah, I mean, it is strange, right, to
Mm.
hate the Koreans that had worked for the Japanese when in fact it was the Japanese who were the actual colonizers, right? So
Yeah.
it is a little odd. But I think there was a way in which the fact that it was their own countrymen participating in the subjugation of their own people that was particularly raw for a lot of Koreans, right? I do think the other thing was there were practical issues here as well, right? Like the Japanese might have declared their surrender, but the Japanese soldiers were still on the ground with guns, right? This kind of thing. So right? You're not going to go attack the person with the guns, right?
Right.
Necessarily,
Right.
right? Is part of it. But I do think even with that said, let's set aside, that practicality. I do think that there was a rawness with which Koreans ex understood and experienced Korean collaborators because it was their own, if you will, flesh and blood subjugating their own people that struck a nerve for Koreans. And so it was one of the three things, I think, one of the three major things I think all Koreans were unified around, right? I think most Koreans, almost virtually all Koreans wanted some form of land reform and land
Mm.
redistribution, right? Which also had to do with Japanese colonial rule because so much of the land was taken up by, right, the Japanese colonial settlers and the Oriental Development Company. Workers, newly emerging workers wanted rights, right? Particularly after working under mostly Japanese bosses and Japanese owners. And then lastly, but equally important, was they wanted justice, right?
Mm.
They wanted to know that the people who had prospered and directly collaborated with the Japanese, that they would be justice for those people, right? And that equally important, that they would not participate in the making of the new nation, right? That they would be left out of that process, right? And we can figure out like what the punishment should be, but the minimal punishment is that they can't take part in the nation, in the rebuilding of the new nation, right? Um, and as I show in the book, it's primarily because of the colonial. There was a practicality issue. Most of the skilled people with expertise were people who worked under the Japanese. I mean,
Mm.
there's just no way to deny that, right? And that was by design, by colonial design, right? It was the point. Um, and but I think there's also evidence that the Koreans could have quite managed on their own, right? And I think the one place that they absolutely needed to have a purge was the colonial police,
Mm.
right? I think undoubtedly that is the one area that the Koreans, you understood, given the colonial legacy around the colonial police. I mean, they were seen as the hated symbol of colonial rule, right? Not only because of their daily brutality, but because they were also involved in the rice collection process, where they were also involved in daily brutalities, right? So they were really seen as the face of colonial rule, and you just couldn't have the unit or institution that was supposed to preserve security and order have former colonial police. And there were members of the KDP, the Conservative Party, Chen Jin, a famous conservative, who was head of the Detective Bureau, who said, we can't have these people in the colonial police. We need to purge them, right? This was
Mm.
not a radical communist, right? There were many people who were center right, members, and some people of the KDP who understood they just could not have these people remain. But most members of the KDP thought that, and General Hodge thought that if they did not have these former members, right, that that the police would be overrun by leftists and Marxists, et cetera, right, or communists, right? That was always the allegation. But people like Chen Jin didn't think that was the case. They thought they could find perfectly good policemen who weren't, wedded to, particular ideologies,
Mm.
and so forth, right? And so, you know, so there is this deep desire for justice, right? And you see this immediately after the liberation, before the Americans get there. But not all Koreans are out for vigilante justice. There's people's courts that have like a system of a process in place, right? Like they don't want just violence, right? They want some order to this thing because they want justice. Justice and vigilante violence are two different things for some members, right?
Yeah.
And when the centrist coalition comes into power, one of the things on their platform is to purge collaborators from the police and the bureaucracy, et cetera. And they eventually come to a criteria. And that this criteria, I would say, is quite modest in the sense of how many people are going to be caught in the net that is defined as a collaborator. And it takes on the definition it resembles the definition of collaborator that you see in European societies. And what we see in European societies who instituted that definition of collaborators is they um, they had punitive punishment for the people that were powerful and worked very closely with the Japanese in positions of higher authority, right? That whether it's government or business, that they were at the very elite, right? That they were recruiting Korean conscripts, etc., right? At the very top of these government organizations. Other people, they decided would be charged with some form of collaboration, right? Because maybe they, enlisted for the Japanese Imperial Army or something like that, right?
Mm.
But those people were given very small punishments. Their punishment was you could not vote for 10 years or 5 years, right? You could not participate in public office, meaning, right, you couldn't run for office, etc., right? So the
Mm.
idea was like, we need to we need to have some reckoning with our collaboration as past. We'll punish those who had the most authority and most power and benefited the most from it, right? But the rest of the people, they will be punished, but their punishment would not be long-term imprisonment or execution in some cases with the highest figures, right? The
Mm.
rest of these people would not be allowed to vote, for example, is what they would be given. No jail time, none of this kind of stuff, right? And that made up the large majority of people who would be deemed a collaborator, right? And the thinking was, I think, that the nation needed to heal.
Mm.
So casting a wide net that imposed really draconian, narrow, like wide definitions of collaboration, one would be problematic because collaboration's always been a little hazy and gray, right? Is sort of the point. Hard to pin down, right?
Mm.
But on the other hand, you needed justice, and so the idea was that we had to come to some form of justice and define these people, and we don't want them to participate initially in the nation building process. But after some time, these people could also be brought back into the nation and be part of the people, of the Korean people, was the thought, right?
Mm.
And that resembled much of what happened in lots of places in Europe, right? At least after the initial bloodshed. There was a lot of bloodletting initially, right? Of course. But once the authorities went in and, had some process to it, that was the idea. Punish those who had the most power, who benefited the most, who was closest in authority to Japanese colonial officials, right? Those people got real punitive punishments, long jail times, etc. But it was only a handful, just a handful, right?
Mm.
And then everybody else maybe have been defined as a collaborator, but they got much, much uh, less punitive punishment. And but what the thing was? It was still too much for the people in the colonial police. And the colonial police react sharply to it. They make death threats at Kim Kyu-sik and Yoon Young and the people of the centrist coalition,
Mm.
calling them traitors and saying that, essentially like we should be looking forward, not backwards, etc. Right? And of course, these people have a certain stake in making these kinds of arguments, right? Because a lot of the people in the colonial police had collaborated. But even this sort of definition of collaborators that would have only been very punitive for a very small number of people, it's still too much for these people. And the police working in the colonial police force react very sharply, start making death threats. Yo and Young needs to sleep in a different bed every night to try to avoid being assassinated. Kim Kyu-sik takes refuge in a hospital 10 miles south um, from Seoul, and he tells American officials at that point, it's either the police chiefs or me and Yo. You got to
Mm.
choose, right? Is what they say at that point. But the whole point here is like Koreans wanted justice for collaboration, undoubtedly. A reckoning with that was immensely important, and we know that today because the ghosts still are here, or not here, but where you are, right in Korea, right? They're still an unfinished part of this history. And the sad part of it'll never feel finished, right? Because many of these people died already, right? There will be no justice at this point. But because, uh, you know, there was no finishing, you have the remnants of this discourse that remains, a grievance and a resentment that was never quite fulfilled. There was never a sense of justice realized, I think, for the people in Southern Korea. And and therefore they're still grappling with it to a large extent.
The division of Korea rather than Japan, the unresolved justice. If it weren't so tragic and millions of people's of lives involved, it would be ironic or a good story. Rather, but it's the reality. Can you say something, perhaps, Cornell, about the on the ground reality in that 45 to 48 period? Because I'm curious how much or if at all, obviously you weren't there yourself or alive at the time, but what that must have been like. Was there a huge change? You mentioned people having to sleep in different beds and in hospitals, but going from, to the end of 45 when Japanese colonization ends, then you have that 3 year trustee period. And then 48 when the two Koreas begin. What was that 3 years on the ground like? Were there still police walking around with guns? Was there still Japanese in the streets? Do you have it? Were people living well? Was it boisterous? Was it safe? Any sense of that, Cornell?
Yeah, no, that's really again, part of what I tried to get to was the lived experience, which I tried to access through oral histories,
Mm.
Korean film, literature, and these other kinds of alternative sources to official government sources, right? To capture what must have been an extraordinary moment, right? At least initially, right? Where 40 years of colonial rule comes to an end. You are finally free. And in fact, like, you know, many people can't even believe it, right? I have this story of this young man, Yi Che, who gets his draft notice on August, 2 days before, right? And he's told to show up on August 16th. And on the morning of August 16th, he's still thinking about showing up, right, to fulfill his conscription duty. And you're like, what? You just the emperor just announced their surrender, right?
Mm.
It was just so unfathomable given his, Yi Il-che's life and most Koreans, right? I think I write somewhere in the book, 80% of Koreans were, less than 40, 45 years old, meaning that for large majorities of Koreans, Japanese colonial rule was all they knew, right? And there was in the minds of many of them like no future. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. And then August 15th comes, and for a lot of people, August 15th needs to bleed into 16th, 17th, and 18th before they actually experience liberation. And there's real euphoria. If you look at particularly some of the pictures I've captured in the book, some of the pictures that come along with the book that captures a lot of the euphoria, right? And so,
Mm.
you have this moment where people are seizing Japanese lands, and they're not being prompted by anybody, right? This is not some revolutionary activist saying, we're going to go take the land. These people organically, spontaneously are taking land. They're chasing colonial police out of town. Um, right? They're seizing control of the factory floor, right? And demanding severance payments from their former Japanese colonial owners and taking ownership of their companies, etc., right? Now, I highlight that, but I also suggest there's a lot of complexity there, right? Like when people are seizing the factory floor, they're not necessarily seizing it because they think they're going to start a working class revolution necessary. They know like they're the only people that now can run the factory if they want to keep their jobs, right? And some of them, in fact, have to turn to capitalists, and they would like to find conscientious capitalists to help invest in their companies and et cetera, right? So, part of this is suggest there's enormous euphoria. There are these spontaneous actions, but there's complexity in these actions, right? They're not just being inspired wildly by utopic revolutionary dreams. There's real practical realities that are intervening in the ways that are shaping, what Koreans are doing, right? So
Mm.
some Korean peasants are seizing Japanese owned land. Others are negotiating long-term leases, right, with their landlords. Or in fact, a lot of them are buying their lands from landlords, right? At 10 cents to a dollar because landlords are afraid at this time that all of their lands are going to become usurped, right? And repossessed. So they're willing to sell it at 10 cents to a dollar. Um, so there's a wide range of actions is what I wanted to show, but I also wanted to show through these different sources the feel of this particular moment, right? And they're wonderful, wonderful stories of people like Yil Che, uh, Chon Suk-kyu, the woman who becomes later a very famous writer, where she's listening to the emperor announce the surrender on a transistor radio in her husband's office, right? She's all alone.
Mm.
And she needs to listen to it a couple of times, and she just sort of sinks into her couch, right? And she just had a 1-year-old boy, and I can imagine, right, thinking that my 1-year-old boy is going to live in a free Korea, right?
Mm.
Unimaginable, right? And trying to capture some of that, right? Some of the color, some of the texture, some of the emotions was part of it. But while acknowledging the difficulties and the challenges and the perils that came with this particular moment, right? Like not idealizing it completely and suggesting a utopic society was going to arise immediately, right? That's not what was going to happen. But I wanted to do both, right? It was an extraordinary moment.
Mm.
But on one hand, there were also complexities, there was challenges, there were perils that people acknowledge, right? And then after that, you have the US that comes in, and because of Hodge's policies, essentially he tries to roll it all back, tries to put the genie back into the bottle. And so all the changes that occurred, right? He takes back all of the Japanese lands, and the military government takes that into custody. Same with the factories, right? And then largely allows the former colonial police to return to their positions in their personnel, right? So essentially, they're going back to the pre-liberation colonial status quo for the time being, right? And so you can imagine for the Koreans for about almost a month who enacted a lot of these changes, right? took seized land. That land must have felt like theirs at that point, right? They've held it for 3.5 weeks, right? And now it's sort of ripped back from them by the military government. And um, you know, and then I think there was a moment where Koreans were, we need to give the Americans, we need to figure out, we need to give everybody time to sort things out. They didn't want to give them a lot of time, but the idea was foreign powers are here. They have the guns. They have to figure out, what the next steps are forward, right? So there was some patience there for a bit, right, with returning to the status quo. But it went on and it went on, much too long for many Koreans who felt like nothing had changed under American military government rule from the colonial period. And about a year into it, in September of 1946, about a year after liberation, you have the autumn uprisings where peasants, farmers rise up, and they rise up not because they're interested in revolutionary action or in dispelling the American military government. No, that's not what they're rising up because they have everyday grievances over police brutality,
Mm.
the unfairness of rice collection, right? And rice shortages, right? There's just daily, everyday grievances, and they had reached their limit. And this powder keg is lit by, the fuse is lit with the killing of an unarmed demonstrator in Daegu, which is the city that starts the rebellion and then kind of spreads like wildfire, right? And, a lot of times people are like, the American officials, at least the military command, would say this was a communist conspiracy led by
Mm.
northern agitators, right? Um, and other people would say this was a revolutionary uprising by the people, and so this was a revolution denied. And I don't think either is true. I think these were ordinary Koreans who had seen no change between the American military government and the Japanese colonial period, and they were not expecting a paradise or utopia, but they
Mm.
were expecting some daily changes to their lives that would make their lives better. And their lives were not better. In some cases, that they were worse. And I think they had sort of reached their limit, many of them, and they had organically, spontaneously rose up. Now, the other thing that isn't quite covered in the Daegu uprising, which is fascinating,
Mm.
is that there was a cholera outbreak there that killed 10,000 people in the city of Daegu, right? There's a waterborne disease that
Mm.
killed 10,000 people. And as a result, they had to quarantine the whole city. And one of the implications or significance of that is they couldn't bring supply and food into the city. So Southern Koreans were already suffering from rice shortages, supply shortages, etc., right? In the city of Daegu in particular, it was exacerbated by this quarantine and, of course, the devastation from the loss of 10,000 lives as a result of this epidemic, contagious disease, right? Which is not quite frequently cited, right? But again, I raised that to point out that it wasn't revolutionary aspirations necessarily. It wasn't a communist conspiracy. It was like literally an everyday life that was getting progressively worse, and in the case of Taegu, made worse by this contagious disease, right? And that they had reached their limit and that they had rose up. And in response to that rebellion, the US military government empowers the police even more, sends in the military battalion as well, and they brutally suppress the uprising. It takes months because it spreads like wildfire. But if by the end of 1946, so it takes about 3 months to finally put down all of the uprisings, right? And as a result of as a result of this event, the police state really gets supercharged at this point, right? They're given new powers, right? There are old colonial ordinances that are restored that forbid things like, public gatherings, protests, and so forth, right? And so people's committees, workers groups, unions, farmers groups, there's virtual extinction to those groups at this point. Their leaders are either underground or in prison at this particular point, right? And so at that point, you have a real police state that, by 1947, early 1947, there's a police state, and Hodge cannot get himself to purge the police in part because of these uprisings, right? So you see how these sort of sequence of events makes it harder and harder for someone like Hodge, who's already nervous in kind of pulling the trigger in implementing reforms to the police or land reform, etc.
You mentioned the story, one of the stories, the young man who gets called up for conscription on sort of August 16th, 17th, and you do these. The photos, by the way, I just want to say something. There's lovely photos in this book, which I didn't expect. When I saw the cover and I saw the title, I thought this was going to be quite a dry history. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but some of the photos in the book, I'm looking at one of Song Gi-jong, the gold medalist at the 1936 Summer Olympics, and he's holding intentionally a laurel wreath in front of the Japanese flag, so that photo could be printed to deny his working for the Japanese. But there are beautiful photos in here. And when I saw you, Kornel, like when you referenced the first novel or short story, I thought that's quite interesting. But then when another one came and another one came, I stopped and I thought, I don't read many history books that do this, that analyze history, not just through archives and resources, which you do. This is genuine history, but you also incorporate so much sort of culture and media of the time to tell this story. I'm not sure what my question is here. Can you say something about that? Did you receive any pushback? Was it considered not correct history? Is that a new way that storytelling is going? Something about that methodology, Cornell?
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, I have gotten questions around the usage of novels, stories, film, which I think is, it's not completely new. Some historians have used it, but it's still kind of a scarce enough practice that people are,
Mm,
a little bit surprised when they see it. Um, so I was, and we could talk about this a little bit later. Like one of the things I really did want to do was center ordinary Koreans in
mm,
ways that the previous scholarship had not, right? And again, part of this had to do with the framing as this period as a prelude to the Cold War. So people just wanted to jump ahead, right? But I really wanted to stay and linger in this period and linger with ordinary Korean aspirations and desires and so forth. But like, how do you act, right? This is the perennial most difficult question for historians. Like, easy to access the perspectives of leaders, presidents, except right, they have libraries, right?
yeah.
Except for General Hodge, which is dismaying to us, right? Like us historians, meaning Douglas MacArthur has his own archive in Virginia.
Mm.
He's got millions and millions of documents, right? Which is a reflection of his own personality, right? Loved
Mm.
hearing his own voice and under thought about his legacy all the time. Hodge does not leave behind a scrap of personal paper, right? Which again says something about the man, right? I
Yeah.
think it says something about him, right? So that is the one area. But getting back to the point is that generally speaking, the people in leadership, people with power, etc., those people leave behind a written trail that historians can follow and analyze. Ordinary people, particularly uneducated, illiterate, right? People who are not writing diaries, etc. These people are much harder to find and follow, and so that was a challenge. So I thought oral histories is a possibility, right? And lo and behold, KBS on its like I think it was like a 50th anniversary of liberation. I can't
Mm.
remember which anniversary date it was. Did a thing where they tried to track down all of the living people who kind of lived during the occupation and interviewed them. And those interviews then became an edited volume, which was great. It was I think it was edited and published in 2005, right? Um, and so that was a really terrific source, and that was where Yil Che's story. That's where I got his incredible story from, right?
Mm.
Um, but the other place I found, the other source I found by accident, and I guess this is uh, maybe a reason why people should read more why we should read more broadly outside of our disciplines. So I started reading Korean literary scholarship, Korean literary studies,
Mm.
and I came across a book written by Janet Poole, which is about uh, late Korean writers during the late colonial period, right? During the late 30s, early 40s. And it's a story about um, how did Korean writers write at a time when there was no future to imagine, right? She called it a disappearing future, right? Under Japanese colonialism, right? So that's
Mm.
one condition. And then the other condition was, how do you write when there's a colonial system that is surveying, right? And repressing? And her answer is they write brilliantly, right? Because, and it's true, right? There's something about challenging, difficult conditions and circumstances that produces great art.
Mm.
I wish this was not the case, but
Mm.
it is the case in a lot of time, and it wasn't the case of the Koreans. So I'm reading her book, and it's a study that looks at aesthetics and other things that I'm not that familiar with. But reading her descriptions of these stories, Lee Tae-jun's writings, Park Tae-won, right? Bong Joon-ho's grandfather, who went north eventually, right? His grandfather was a famous writer. Hwang Soo-won, right? Wrote brilliantly during this late colonial period. And then at some point, it just sort of dawned on me, which maybe should have dawned on me earlier. These people who wrote during the late colonial period, they must have written through the liberation, right? Like it's close enough. Like if you were writing in 42, 43, 44, why wouldn't you
Mm.
be writing in 45, 46? And lo and behold, I tracked down all of the writers that I saw, and then I tried to track down all of their later writings. And not surprisingly, they wrote just as brilliantly of the post-liberation period. And one of the great things was many of the techniques they used a technique called I novel, which sort of they were writing fictitiously, but they were writing fictitiously semi-biographically,
Mm.
right? They
Mm.
would present themselves as the protagonist in the story, right? So it had a lot of great kind of factual details about like, taking over a factory floor and, all the details and what that moment felt like and so forth, right? And so, when I discovered these writings and these films and the oral histories, I was like, this is how I can help kind of capture the lived experience, right? Like
Mm.
this is where methodologically, you know, I can show the reader what this moment might have felt like, give people color, give people texture, right? So I'm heavily indebted to Korean studies, right? Both global Korean studies, but particularly in Southern Korea and in North America, right? And I'm indebted in two ways. One is there is 4 decades of Korean language scholarship that I rely on in the book to get me the details. How
Mm.
many factories were seized, right? How many workers were involved in the worker self-management movement? How much land was seized by the peasants? How much land was bought by peasants, right? And Korean scholars have done impeccable, meticulous research on this front, right? Which I am eternally grateful for, right, to help tell my story. But this kind of historical sociology doesn't quite get to the feel, right? I mean, sure, 900 factories were taken. That is important to note.
Mm,
But what did the worker feel like in that particular moment, right? And so I took that 4 decades of historical sociology to give me the kind of macro, right, the structure, et cetera, larger patterns. And then I use the brilliant creative works of Korean writers and artists of the 1930s and 40s to help capture the lived experience for readers. So that was sort of the two-part research methodology that I use, right?
mm.
The secondary research by Korean scholars, 4 decades, historical sociology, and then the artistic creative works by these writers who I draw and tap liberally from. And I think one of the things I hope that people understand and I wanted to showcase was, Koreans were doing great creative works long before the current Korean wave, before
Mm.
Hallyu, right? Like they were producing brilliant stuff decades and decades ago, right? And so part of this was obviously helping to capture a moment, and these sources allowed me to do it, right? So there was a kind of methodological reason for it, but it
Mm.
was also to showcase the kind of creative Korean works that long predated our, particular Korean moment of sort of global cultural relevance.
I found myself doing something similar recently after lots of academia that I find great value in analyzing Korea through movies and literature and stories, because I feel sometimes I, it's cliche and it's pithy, but fiction sometimes tells us more than fact, or it at least complements in a way. When you mentioned your indebtedness to Korean studies, Connor, which we all are, and the scholars that have done the necessary and arduous work which we rely on, your book, and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but when you look through Korean studies, you can find people that take certain positions. You seem to have Bruce Cummins as one of the resources and sources that you would use, and that's a name in the Korean studies field that some people are for, some people are against, which is weird to say in academia. But people on the outside of academia would think everything's objective. Once you get inside of it, you see factions and divisions and opinions. Um, how would you characterize your book in that? Do you feel that in your work in relation to Cummins' approach, I'm asking you, Cornell, are there aspects of his analysis that you find particularly interesting? Are there different areas of your arguments where you go apart? Any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this about Bruce Cummings' Origin of the Korean War. Um, I mean, it's a classic, right? I mean, it's
Mm,
4.5 decades, and at least in the English language scholarship, it is still, even though it's out of print, it is still the go-to text in my humble opinion, and I would say in the opinion of a lot of people, even if people who would maybe not completely agree with everything, between the depth of the research, the writing, and really it might not sound original now, but my God, when it was published in 1981, the
mm,
originality of the argument, everybody has to reckon with the argument about the Korean War being a civil war that has its origins and that dates back to the colonial period and this period that I look at, right? And in fact, if my book is still read 45 years from now, I will feel immense gratitude and satisfaction is what I would say, right? That after 4 decades, in some ways, you're still the go-to book for a particular subject. But I guess for me, it has been 4.5 decades. I just thought that there had to be sort of different ways to look at this period, right? And by framing my period in a way where I try not to look ahead to the division and the Cold War, right? That's not the reason for the journey for me, right?
mm,
Whereas for Cummings, which in 1981 made complete sense, right? Trying to understand like how do we come to the period of division and war in this way, right? And it's still a relevant question to ask. But that was the reason for the journey there, right? And so when you look
mm,
back to the history, you're gonna tell the history to tell the history of the origins of what comes later, right? And therefore, you're going to use certain conceptions, a certain kind of Cold War framing in understanding much of this period. Where I wanted to say was the Koreans and the Americans did not know those things were going to come and happen, right? Like the people on the ground did not know division and war were inevitable and were going to happen, right? And so, like, what did it mean in these years where which isn't to say they're not concerned about what's happening politically, etc., right? But nothing is guaranteed, right? And so, how do people act? What do they believe in, right? What do they want? What do they aspire to, right? And those kinds of questions are the questions I wanted to center my analysis on, right? Rather than it being kind of tertiary to understanding the origins moment for the war and the division is what I would say. And so as a result, I think by centering ordinary Korean aspirations and by centering the Korean reform, by centering both the Korean and American reformers within the military government, right? Uh, what I think I do is what I aspired to do was one, which I've already talked about, was like add layers to the coming story, right? And think about kind of the broader spectrum of aspirations and hopes that Koreans, particularly ordinary Koreans, had for their Korean futures, right? In Cummings's account, it's mostly, kind of right, left, and then Yo and Young, who we talked about a bit in a little bit in the book, right? And so that's yeah, and I wanted to, and I thought there were, there were additional layers to that story, right? There was a broader spectrum, and I could tap that in part because I have 4 decades of Korean language scholarship that Cummings did not have access to, right? I
Mm.
did. I could capture the feel of the lived experience of ordinary people in ways maybe that Cummings couldn't. One, because that wasn't the aim of his book, but also two, because like all of these writings by Chae Man-sik, Yi Tae-jin, these they've only come to light really in the last 2 decades, and in the English language world, probably in the last 10 years, right? And so I've had access to materials that some materials that Cummings didn't, right? So I'm adding kind of layers to that particular story that go beyond the Cold War story, right? It's not a two-layer cake, right? It's a real kind of multi-layer cake is what I suggest. And I also wanted to suggest that the American response was not monolithic either, right? I wanted to contextualize Hodge. Um, and I wanted to give more voice to the reformers. Again, as a part of the way to suggest like this wasn't inevitable. There were these alternative moments. There were
Mm.
these alternative paths not taken, is what I want to emphasize. And in doing so, I wanted to, draw a line that was far more jagged from August 1945 to 48 and 50, right? That it was far less straight than I think, sometimes some of these sort of accounts suggest. So a lot of this was trying to intervene and like, kind of take it out of a kind of strictly Cold War framing, right?
Mm.
And try to take it out of the framing of trying to understand this sort of history backwards, right? Thinking about like where does division and war come from? And I'm not, so I'm trying to ask the question like, I'm trying to analyze this moment in its sort of own right while understanding the forces that are eventually, taking us to uh, those pivotal events, right? But in describing those pivotal events, suggesting there was real contingencies, there were alternative pathways, et cetera, right? Is sort of
Yeah.
what I want to suggest. And I tried to, part of it is I really did want to try to contextualize everybody, even people I do not personally hold in high regard, right? Syngman Rhee, I think General Hodge also made real mistakes, but I did want to suggest like where that kind of decision making,
Mm.
what they were thinking at a particular moment, like what ideas were shaping them, what conditions and circumstances were leading them to the actions that they were taking, to at least to some degree give people an understanding of why people made the choices that they made, even if you don't agree with the choices that they made.
Yeah. I love the approach to focus on those voices and to listen to them, to extend the scope of analysis. And some might point to Catherine Weatherby's work on the opening of the Soviet archives as post-Cummins, but there's a Vietnamese author whose name I'm very embarrassingly forgetting now, who wrote Nothing Ever Dies, which was a brilliant book.
Yeah. Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thank you very much. And when I read that book, it just blew me away with the way that that was all told. And I didn't even expect to find a chapter on the Korea-Vietnam relations. And I saw similar parallels between your two work in that the way the arguments unfolded. I thought it was fascinating. And also how you put forward Jeju as an example of what could have been, of a path not taken. And, you know, with the popularity of Poksak, or when life gives you tangerines at the moment, there's something there for people as well. Just before maybe, Kornel, I bring this to the close and ask you for some recommendations. Obviously, there's a lot that we haven't covered, but is there something that perhaps that I've missed or we've missed, or something to say about this book or the work, the conversation thus far?
Wow, that's the question that stops me a little bit. Trying to figure out what particular moments or um things that I maybe want to highlight for the reader. I mean, we've already really talked about this. Like I'm obviously I wanted to get you can't get the history right. No one gets the history completely right, right? But I want to
Yeah,
tell it with as much complexity and as much nuance as possible, right?
yeah,
So that was one. But I really also wanted to tell a really good story, right? So there was the
yeah,
right. So, I want to encourage readers to think about this book not just for the history, of course, which I think is important, and I want people to read it and
mm,
give them, a different perspective about this history, or a perspective they didn't know about this particular history. But I really did also want to write it so that people could actually enjoy, maybe enjoy is too strong a word, but actually enjoy
yeah,
reading the history and the narrative that that I tried to tell here. So it was obviously I want to tell complex, nuanced history, provide that for the reader. But equally important to me was to tell a good story, and I want people to read it and tell me what they think about the history, but also tell me what you think about the writing, and how they felt, this is could be a way of, this is the kind of historical writing that might draw more people to be interested in history,
yeah.
and to get different perspectives.
Perhaps it was useful that you studied a lot of Korean literature and writers, great writers who were doing that brilliant writing, because some of it must have rubbed off. It was one of those embarrassing things where Umberto Eco called it the anti-library. You have all these books on your shelves, and many of them you haven't read yet, and you're waiting for the right time to pick them up. And I didn't. It arrived in the post, and I didn't pick it up straight away, because I thought, there's another history book I have to read. And yeah, you read it, but then when I picked up, I was like, oh, why didn't I pick this up sooner? Because some books you read for ideas, some books you read for the facts and data. You read them for all manner of purposes, but this was genuinely enjoyable to read. So you have definitely achieved that, Kornel. Thank you for sharing your time here. Like, there is much more on the conversation list that we could have covered. Um, as we bring this to a close, recommendations, and I've no idea what you're going to say here, like, but movies, books, dramas, songs, anything. Give us two or three things, Kornel, that we can whet our palate with, and it can be related to your book or to Korean studies or just what you have on your stereo at home. Anything.
Yeah, sure. My music taste is quite dull, so I won't recommend anything music wise. Um, I would recommend to to um to your listeners, uh looking at the writings of the late Korean writers during the late colonial period and through the post-liberation period. People like Yi Tae-jin, Chae Man-sik, Park Tae-won, Hwang Soo-won, right? Because again, I think, one, they're wonderful to read. They're creative, beautifully written. But the other thing I want, I think it's important that, everyone sort of thinks the current Korean wave came out of nowhere, right?
Mm.
Um, and I'm just suggesting that there's a long history of interesting and creative works, produced by Korean writers and artists. And I do think this earlier writing is definitely worth reading. And many of them, if they're, it's an English language audience, many of them have now been increasingly translated, so you can find translated versions of them. So I would suggest that. Um, the the other book recommendation has nothing to do with anything here. It's a very American story.
Yeah.
But I don't know. There is something, it's beautifully written. The book is The Gilead by Marianne Robinson, which is a book about a pastor, an American pastor growing up in Iowa. And the book is a letter from this aging pastor who knows who he's dying, and he's writing his last letters to his young son. He got married very late, and it's a story about his life, but he's telling it to his son, who's probably 7 or 8 years old, but he knows he's dying soon, so he wants to leave behind a record for him. And aside from the fact that it's beautifully written, there is something. Um, there's something very old school about it. I think I'm kind of an old soul in some
Mm,
ways. Um, but the thing that I think draws me to that book in particular is that it's the idea that I think most people want to do the decent thing. They want to be decent. But there are circumstances, conditions, etc., that prevent a lot of more decency to emerge, right? But the book really is about the interior core of human beings, and
mm,
and maybe it's a little idealized, but the way in which people are reaching and wanting to be decent, but there's things holding them back, right? Circumstances and life happenings and conditions, right? And I don't know, maybe in this particular moment where it feels like the world is on fire. I don't know, that particular message does resonate with me, right? And again, not to idealize. I mean, humans are also capable of great harm and evil. We know this. But the idea that most people are searching to be decent,
mm.
but it is life circumstances and conditions that prevent them to do so. I don't know why, but it is. Maybe I shouldn't find that hopeful, right? Because conditions and circumstances are always problematic. But nevertheless, it does give me hope. And at the end of the day, the book does end with people being and reaching for decency. And I don't know, that resonates with me in some odd way.
I think it's a wonderful message. It sounds rather traumatic, I must admit, being a father to read something like that. Somebody asked me last week, David, have you read Remains of the Day? And I had to confess that yes, I have, and I cried when I got to the end. It was brutal, and the Gilead now goes on my list, Cornell. Um, Thank you very much for all of this. You've entertained me, you've informed me, you've educated me, and it's been wonderful getting to know you for this last couple of hours. So thank you very much for your time. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for having me, David. It was a wonderful conversation, and I really, really, I'm grateful for the invitation and the 2 hour conversation we had.